In a quiet Gloucestershire town down a narrow road called Potter's Pond, there's an old building that looks like it belongs to another century. Low beams, uneven walls, dark rooms, and corners that seem to swallow the light. From the outside, it doesn't look like the kind of place that would become one of Britain's most infamous haunted houses. It looks old, it looks weathered, but it doesn't immediately explain why so many people have claimed to feel watched whilst inside. And it definitely doesn't explain why, in later years, there were reports that carers looking after the owner were so frightened of the building that they didn't want to enter it alone after dark. That's the part of this story that's difficult to ignore. Ghost hunters being scared inside of a haunted inn is one thing. People go there expecting something to happen. They arrive with cameras, torches, voice recorders, and the hope that the building will give them a story to tell. But care workers are different. They weren't there to chase ghosts. They were there to do a job. And yet, according to reports, some of them were so unsettled by the ancient Ram Inn that they eventually had to come in pairs. Which raises an obvious question. What was it about this building that frightened people so much? Because by that point, the ancient Ram Inn had already developed a reputation as one of the most haunted buildings in England. It had become the kind of place where almost every room had a different story attached to it, where visitors claimed to hear footsteps, voices, dragging sounds, and movement in empty parts of the house. There were stories of a room that even the owner treated with caution. There were stories of a woman accused of witchcraft. There were stories of child spirits. Beneath all of it, there was an older claim that the building itself stood on land that had been troubled long before the inn was ever built. But as with most haunted places, the closer you look, the harder it becomes to separate the history from the legend. Because the building is real, the age is real, the historical importance is real. But some of the most famous stories attached to it are much harder to prove. So the real mystery isn't just whether the ancient Ram Inn is haunted. The deeper question is how one old building in a small Gloucestershire town became a place that people were genuinely afraid to enter alone. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is William, and this is the Baker Street Bureau. If true crime, paranormal, and the outright unexplainable are your thing, you're in the right place. If you like the cut of my jib, make sure to go down there and give the like button a big old click. Now, without further gilding the lily, this is a story of the ancient Ram Inn, a place built on layers of legend and fear. The ancient Ram Inn stands in Wootton under Edge, a market town in Gloucestershire, not far from the Cotswold Edge. Today, the building is known mainly for its paranormal reputation. But long before ghost hunts, live streams, and haunted overnight stays, it was very much part of a different world. It's a Grade 2 listed building, which means it isn't just old in the casual sense. It's officially recognised as historically important. The structure that survives today is believed to be late medieval, with later altercations in the 1500s and beyond, which is odd because the ancient Ram Inn is often described in paranormal circles as dating back to the 1100s, sometimes with the year 1145 attached to it. That date is very important as it pushes the building deep into the medieval period. It makes the inn feel almost ancient in the truest sense, as if it had been watching over the town for nearly 900 years. But the physical evidence seems more complicated than that. A historical analysis of the building suggests that the main surviving structure is probably later than some of the legends claim, with evidence pointing closer to the late 1400s. That doesn't make it less interesting. If anything, it makes the story more interesting because it tells us something important off the rip. The ancient Ram Inn has two histories. One is the documented history, a late medieval building altered over time, connected to the local area, the wool trade, possible church use, and centuries of ownership. The other is the haunted history. The curses, the violent spirits, the pagan burial ground, the witch, the bishop's room, and the terrifying experiences reported by visitors. And the story of the ancient Ram Inn sits right where those two histories overlap. In the medieval and early modern periods, Wootton Under Edge was a town shaped by trade, religion, and local industry. The area was connected with the wool trade, and the building itself appears to have had ties to that world. Historic records also suggest it may once have functioned as something like a church house, a building connected to life at the nearby parish. This all grounds the inn in ordinary history before the ghost stories begin. This wasn't just a random spooky house. It sat close to a church. It had a role in the community. It passed through different hands and it changed with the town around it. By the early 1800s, the building was known as the Ram, and by then it had a clearer identity as an inn or a public house. It would have been a place where people drank, swapped stories, and stayed the night. And that's where buildings like this began to gather tales. Not all at once, not in one dramatic evening, but slowly. An old room becomes a room people avoid. A strange sound becomes a local tale. A death, a rumor, or a half-remembered event becomes attached to a staircase, a bedroom, or a beam. Over decades, the building itself becomes a container for everything people say happened there. The inn is a perfect example for that process because the building's physical form almost encourages it. It doesn't feel open or modern, it feels enclosed. Its rooms don't have the neat, predictable layout of newer houses. Floors, walls, and ceilings carry the weight of different centuries. And when people walk into a place like that, they don't always experience it neutrally. They bring the stories with them. If someone tells you that a room is haunted before you even enter it, then every creak matters more. Every shift in temperature feels personal. Every old timber groan becomes a signal. But even if you strip all of that away, the ancient Ram Inn still has an atmosphere that works on people. It seems to be a part of why its reputation grew so strongly in the modern era. And the person most closely tied to that modern story was John Humphreys. John bought the building in 1968. At the time, it wasn't the most famous haunted attraction that it would later become. It was an old pub, and according to the later family accounts, the original idea was to turn it into a guest house and make something of the entire building. It's an important part of the story, because the modern legend of the inn doesn't begin with a team of ghost hunters or a television crew. It begins with a man buying a neglected old building and living in it. Over time, guests began reporting experiences. That's when the paranormal side of the inn started to grow. People claimed to hear things, feel things, and see things that they couldn't explain. As more people came through the building, the stories multiplied. And the more those stories multiplied, the more the ancient Ram Inn became known as a place where something might happen. John Humphreys eventually became inseparable from the inn's reputation. He was often described as the man who knew the building better than anyone, and yet even he was said to have been cautious around certain parts of it. The most famous of those places was the bishop's room. If the ancient Ram Inn had a center of gravity, it's that room. In haunted house terms, the bishop's room became the place everyone wanted to know about. It was the room with the reputation, the room that seemed to concentrate the fear of the whole building into one enclosed space. It was said to be one of the most active rooms in the inn. Visitors reported strange sensations, unexplained noises, oppressive feelings, and the sense that they weren't alone. Stories grew around it until it became almost a character in its own right. And the reason that works so well as part of the mystery is it gives the haunting a physical focal point. A haunted building is quite broad, but a haunted room, as personal. And it invites a more specific question. What was in that room? Some accounts say that John Humphreys wouldn't sleep in the bishop's room. Others say that he treated it with a kind of wary respect, knocking before entering. Whether every version of that story is perfectly accurate or not, the effect is the same. The room became known as a place even the man who owned the building didn't entirely trust. And once a room gets a reputation, it changes how people experience it. People enter expecting tension. They listen harder and interpret every noise. If something strange does happen, even something small, it confirms what they've already been told. There was also the so-called witch's room. This part of the legend is usually connected to the story of a woman accused of witchcraft, said to have hidden in the building centuries ago before being discovered. Like many of the darker claims attached to the building, the story's difficult to prove in a clean, historical sense, but it's become one of the most repeated elements of its folklore, which matters deeply because haunted locations don't just depend on documented history, they depend on the stories that people repeat. The witch's room brings a different kind of fear into the building. The bishop's room feels like a classic haunted chamber, heavy and oppressive, but the witch's room adds accusation, persecution, secrecy, and violence. It suggests someone hiding, hunted, or trapped. It gives the building a moral darkness, and that's why stories like this cling to old places so easily. They don't have to be proven in the same way as a court record or a deed. They survive because they feel like they belong there. Then there are stories of children. Child spirits appear in many haunted house traditions, partly because they create a immediate emotional response. There is something far more unsettling about the idea of a child trapped in a place rather than an unknown adult ghost. It makes the haunting feel tragic rather than just frightening. At the ancient Ram Inn, reports connected to child spirits have become part of the wider reputation of the building. People have spoken about hearing movement, small voices, and unexplained sounds. Some stories connect these claims to the idea that the inn stands on an ancient burial ground, or that something older lies beneath the structure. That claim, again, needs handling very carefully. The idea that the ancient Ram Inn was built on a pagan burial ground is one of the most dramatic pieces of its folklore, but it's also one of the hardest to verify. It appears quite often in retellings of the story, and it adds quite a powerful explanation for why the building might be haunted. But dramatic explanations aren't always the same as historical explanations. What we can say is that the building stands in an area with a long history, close to a church in a town shaped by centuries of religious and community life. What we can't responsibly say is that every claim about pagan rites, sacrifice, or burial beneath the inn is proven fact. And this is where everything becomes more interesting than a simple ghost story, because with some haunted places, the story collapses if the legend isn't true. And with that, the uncertainty becomes part of the story. If it isn't exactly as old as some people claim, why did that older date become so widely repeated? If the burial ground story isn't firmly documented, why do people keep talking about it? If the witch's room legend is difficult to prove, why does it feel so central to the building's identity? That answer might be that the ancient Ram Inn is a machine for producing stories. Every old house carries marks from the past, but this one seems to have turned those marks into something far bigger. The beams, the uneven rooms, the history, the darkness, and the reports from the visitors all fed into each other. A person hears a noise, they tell someone. The story spreads. The next visitor arrives, already aware of it, then they hear something too. Over time, the building becomes impossible to experience without the legend standing beside you. That's especially true once the inn became a destination for paranormal investigators. By then, people weren't just passing through. They were arriving specifically because they wanted the building to react. Ghost hunters changed the relationship between the inn and its visitors. Instead of simply sleeping there or living there, people entered the building with equipment, questions, and expectations. They would sit in dark rooms and ask for signs, record sounds, and wait. And when you ask an old building to speak, you're already halfway to hearing it answer. That doesn't mean that every experience is fake, and it doesn't mean that people are lying. In fact, the most compelling thing about places like the inn is that many people seem completely sincere about what they felt. The question is whether those experiences come from something supernatural, from the building itself, from expectation, or from some strange combination of all three. And the ancient Ram Inn sits directly in that grey area. It's easy to dismiss a haunted attraction as something designed to scare people, but the ancient Ram Inn's reputation didn't appear overnight as a business plan. According to Caroline Humphreys, the current owner and daughter of John, hi Caroline, if you're watching, I'd love to come visit at some point. The paranormal side developed after guests began reporting their experiences. That gives the story a slower and more organic shape. First, there was a building. Then there were the people who stayed there. Then came the reports, the reputation, and the visitors. By the time care workers were reportedly nervous about entering the building alone, the ancient Ram Inn had become more than an old inn. It had become a place with a public identity so powerful that even people arriving for ordinary reasons couldn't avoid it. Imagine being asked to work there after dark. You step into a building where almost every room has a story. You know people have claimed to hear footsteps when no one is there. You know there's a room people talk about in hushed tones. You know the owner himself has been part of interviews and reports about the haunting. Then the building creaks. Somewhere upstairs, something shifts. A pipe knocks. A floorboard settles. Or maybe there's a sound that doesn't fit any of those explanations. You don't need to believe every legend to understand why someone might not want to be alone in that place. John's relationship with the inn is one of the most important parts of the whole story, because he became both the guardian of the building and part of its legend. He lived with the house through its decay, its fame, and its transformation into a place people traveled to see. For many visitors, John was almost as much a part of the ancient Ram Inn as the beams and the rooms themselves. He could tell the stories. He could point to the places where things were said to have happened. He could describe parts of the building that he found most unsettling. And there's something very human about that. Most haunted house stories focus on the spirits, but this one is also about a man who bought an old building and ended up spending decades inside of a legend. After John passed away, as I mentioned, the inn passed into the direct care of his daughter Caroline, who has spoken about maintaining it, opening it to visitors, and trying to preserve it. Regardless of whether someone believes the haunting, the building itself does need saving. Old listed buildings are not easy to maintain. I used to live in a grade 2 listed building that used to be a tannery. It was a nightmare. They're expensive, fragile, awkward, and full of problems that modern buildings don't have. The ancient Ram Inn's paranormal reputation brings a lot of attention, but the physical structure still has to be looked after as a historical site. So where does that leave us? If you want a clean answer, the ancient Ram Inn probably isn't going to give you one. The historical record tells us it's a genuine late medieval building with deep roots in Wootton under Edge. It tells us the site has a long history, that the building has changed over the centuries, and that some of the more dramatic paranormal claims should be treated carefully. But the witness stories tell us something else. They tell us that people have walked into the ancient Ram Inn and come out frightened. They tell us that certain rooms have built reputations strong enough to affect how people behave around them. They tell us that the building has made people feel watched, unsettled, and unwilling to be alone. Maybe that's the real power of the ancient Ram Inn. A place can be haunted by stories and by reputation. And in that sense, the ancient Ram Inn is absolutely haunted. Because even if you walked into that building as a skeptic, even if you had told yourself every sound had a normal explanation, you'd still know the stories before you reached the stairs. You'd know about the bishop's room. You were aware of the witch's room, and you know about the children and the claims about what lies beneath the floor. And then, when the building shifted in the dark, you'd have to decide for yourself whether you were hearing an old house settling or whether something inside the ancient Ram Inn had finally noticed you were there. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is William, and this is the Baker Street Bureau. If true crime, paranormal, and the outright unexplainable are your thing, you're in the right place. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you've made it this far, I'd ask you go a little further and click that big old like button. And if you've got no plans, feel free to check out another video. Either way, I appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend it with me. But if I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.